Despite being the shortest month of the year, February was surprisingly good in terms of media consumption. In terms of books, movies, and TV shows, I saw an increase in completion compared to January, which kind of leads me to the question of how did I even get anything else done. But before we look at the overall statistics, let's first have a look at the pieces of media themselves. For my media reviews, I'm still very much enjoying doing the collage style, and you can see we already have one in the top left corner here. That one technically was finished in February, but I finished it on the 1st because it was our book club book for January. The meeting wasn't until the 2nd of February, so I thought I was kind of getting away with it. But what I'm actually setting up the review for here is Anyone But You. The general premise of the movie is that our main characters, Bea and Ben, have their meet cute in a coffee shop, which leads to a very good first date. But given some poor decision making on both of their parts, each of the characters ends up thinking that the other one doesn't like them. While their story could end there, they then end up finding themselves invited to a destination wedding in Australia, where the other members of the wedding party try to manipulate them into getting together. Bea very quickly sees through their not so subtle hints, whereas Ben doesn't so much, which I didn't necessarily like for his character, but they decide that given the wedding party is only probably trying to do this because they think that the wedding is in jeopardy given the tensions between the two main characters, they're gonna pretend to be the perfect couple. Given the fact that it is a fairly typical rom-com movie, you can probably expect the kind of shenanigans that go down, and while it was an enjoyable movie, it's not really one that I feel like I need to rewatch. While the characters were mostly likable, I'm never really a big fan of the miscommunication trope, and I kind of feel like the entire movie predicates on that. Like, not necessarily miscommunication in the traditional sense, but maybe just like a lack of communication. Essentially, both of our main characters assuming what the other one was thinking with the way their first date ended. One of the things I very much liked about the movie though is that it is primarily set in Sydney, and having just been to Sydney last year, it was kind of nice to see the places that I've recently visited. There wasn't necessarily a lot of sightseeing highlighted, but even just seeing the Sydney Harbour Bridge and Opera House, I'm like, oh, I went there. I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars out of 5, so essentially a solid watch, but not necessarily as impactful or as enjoyable as I was hoping. In terms of timing, this one was actually watched a lot later in the month compared to other pieces of media, but because I don't necessarily go and fill in my reading journal right after having read or watched something, it means that these things don't necessarily get put in the order they get consumed. That doesn't necessarily bother me so much. What I more so care about is how much space I want to have for particular reviews, and also the positioning of those reviews next to each other. For instance, on the next spread over, we have two things that are very much related to each other, so I knew I wanted to have them together. But on this layout, it's just an eclectic bunch of 3 books and a movie. Let's just ignore the fact that my autofocus decided to choose violence while I was putting this review in, but this one is for Lights Out, which I read as a buddy read with Monica and Rachel. Effectively, they came over for the day, we did some crafty projects, and listened to this one via audiobook. I actually had so much fun with this book. I thought the kind of like banter that we had going on between the main characters was really fun. But the premise behind this book is that we have Allie, who is a trauma nurse, and given the hours she keeps through her job, she finds it difficult to find any kind of like stable romantic partners. Stable more so in the sense of consistent rather than like mentally stable. So to kind of substitute in for that, she just watches a lot of thirst traps on TikTok. One of her favorite accounts in particular though turns out to be run by an ex-partner's roommate slash best friend. This roommate slash best friend is called Josh, and while in day-to-day life he tries to avoid any and all attention possible, his online persona is distinctly different. The story is very much both of them just living out their dark fantasies together, and I personally thought that they were a cute couple. This book does come with a lot of content warnings though, so if there are particular topics that you're sensitive towards or don't really want to read, then checking those out could be worthwhile. I typically don't read the content warnings of most books before I go in, because I consider them spoilers. Like, if the synopsis of a book tells me which tropes I'm going to be experiencing, then I don't get to be surprised. I will say though that despite some of the darker themes in this book, I still had a really great time. I felt like even though we did have some darker themes in there, the story still felt more lighthearted, and despite how much I enjoyed it, I did end up giving this one a 4.5 star rather than a 5, mainly because this is the first book in a standalone series, which means that each book in the series doesn't necessarily depend on the last one. Like, you could, in theory, big theories, I haven't read the second one, but you could in theory read the second one without having read the first, but because they want to set up for the next one, there comes a point where we get kind of a shift in the story, and we get introduced to some new characters, which I assume are going to feature in the second book, but I didn't really care about them. I cared about our main characters. It also felt that the solution to our third act problem kind of just felt too convenient, and although it had been foreshadowed a little bit throughout the book, there wasn't really enough there for it to be believable for me. Yes, I know it is a work of fiction, but I would have preferred if it felt a little bit more realistic and not so much just convenient. Given that February is the season of love, I was trying to consume more romance-related content in the month, so I thought it was a good opportunity to try my hand at some what I'm going to call strictly romance books, not like dark romance or fantasy romance. So my first venture into the world of Emily Henry was Funny Story. This was another one that I really enjoyed. I didn't really know what to expect going in because, as said, I don't look up any kind of content warnings, I don't read blurbs, I don't read synopsi, I don't read them. So going into this one as somebody who is currently planning a wedding and having our main character's engagement being broken off in like the first chapter of the book, I was like, oh no, what's going on? I thought this was a romance. Our main character Daphne, though, has effectively found herself stranded in this town, mainly because she moved here with her now ex-fiance Peter, and this is his hometown. They went to the places he recommended, they hung out with his friends, and so rather than living in the house that they were living in together, which he owns, she now finds herself being flatmate to the only person who can really understand her predicament, which is Miles, the ex-boyfriend of the person who her fiance left her for. We start the book with both of them being notably heartbroken over the situation. That's very understandable when someone you thought was your forever person decides to go off with somebody else. But while drowning their sorrows one night, Daphne and Miles come up with an ingenious plan that they're going to pretend to be together to make their ex-partners jealous. Of course, at that point, they're not even really friends, they're just kind of roommates who mostly avoid each other. But as a kind of subpart of this plan, Miles effectively promises Daphne that he's going to show her the other parts of the town that she didn't get to see or experience because they weren't the kind of things that really fit with who Peter was as a person, essentially giving Daphne an opportunity to discover herself outside of her relationship with Peter. I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed that our main characters weren't perfect people and were never portrayed as being such, and throughout the book we kind of had these running themes of when people tell you the kind of people they are, we should trust them, but then also don't judge one person from the actions of another. Like, just because you've had an experience with one person doesn't mean that all people are like that. I appreciated that our FMC was a librarian and confirmed that audiobooks are still books, and thus my favourite quote from this book was when Daphne convinced Miles to pick up the Chronicles of Narnia, our quote being, "Edmund needs to chill." Although at this stage I haven't read any more Emily Henry, I'd definitely be open to it, and also other books that come under the romance genre, so if you have any recommendations, I'd love to hear them. But flipping on over, and we're into a series of pages that I set up for a marathon that Vogel and I undertook in February. This marathon effectively confirmed to us that we never again want to undertake a marathon that is this long, or at least not necessarily try and watch it all at once, and that marathon was for Attack on Titan, which as far as animes go, really actually isn't that long. I think the total runtime for the series is something like 36 hours, but in doing it all at once we definitely kinda got sick of it. It probably would have been nicer to break it up over several weekends rather than doing it all in one long weekend. That being said though, I did quite enjoy this show. I don't rate the TV shows that I watch, and in terms of doing my review pages, I do one per season. Now, in my previous reading wrap-up, the one we had for January, I did talk about the idea that for most TV shows I was probably going to do a full spread, but given the fact that I watched 4 seasons of Attack on Titan back to back, I figured it was going to be fine just to do 1 page per, especially given for seasons 1 and 2 I didn't have super heaps of things to say, mainly because I didn't take any notes down about my thoughts at the time of watching. When I got to season 3 and 4, I realized that that was probably a mistake because I wasn't going to remember what happened and how I felt about it. So during and at the end of each season, Vogel and I paused watching so that we could take down some notes about the things that we enjoyed, the things that we didn't enjoy so much, and just other general thoughts. In the story though, humanity has been forced to live in cities surrounded by huge walls, which are there to protect them from gigantic man-eating humanoids. These monsters are called Titans, And our main character Eren lives on the outer edge of one of the outer walls, which wouldn't be so much of a problem because, you know, these walls are here to protect them from the Titans, and no Titan has ever been big enough to breach the walls. Until, of course, one day a Titan shows up that is big enough for that. This Titan is dubbed the Colossal Titan, and it kicks a hole in the gate leading to the outside world, meaning the Titans that were outside of the wall can now get in. As can be expected, it doesn't go super well for the humans that were living in that city, and while Eren and his friends Mikasa and Armin manage to escape, sadly, Eren's mum doesn't. Having had to watch his mother get devoured by a Titan, Eren vows that he is going to exterminate the Titans, and thus he enlists in the military along with his friends so that they can train for how to kill them. A decent chunk of this was a rewatch for me, and it was very interesting to see how much I had forgotten, especially from the first season. And although I did literally just complain about watching it as a marathon and it taking quite a while, I do also appreciate having watched it as a marathon because there were some episodes that not a lot really happened. Like, not necessarily in a bad way, you're still getting kind of like context for the story and the different characters and such, but I think if it were the kind of thing where I was watching it week to week, on those weeks I would have been quite frustrated about how much I got. In terms of the collaging that I did on this spread, it's mainly just still images from the TV show itself. I essentially went through and tried to find some key moments that were kind of integral to the plot, whether that be character introductions, revelations, anything like that. As per all of my reviews, if you don't want spoilers, don't look too closely / don't read any of the text I've written. If you don't mind spoilers, then go right ahead, but especially given that I'm doing reviews for 4 separate seasons, the stuff in later seasons definitely could spoil plot points for the first season. On this spread though, I'm setting up my review pages for seasons 3 and 4, and rather than taking still images from the show for these ones, I just went and found some of the promotional materials online. That was a lot easier to do rather than going through however many hours of footage to find particular stills, and it also meant that I had more space to write, because as mentioned before, these were the seasons that I actually took notes for in terms of my thoughts, feelings, what was going on, and that kind of stuff. Coming off the back of season 2 though, season 3 felt really long. And part of the reason for this was that season 2 was only 12 episodes, whereas season 3 was 22 episodes. It also had seemingly more story arcs that we were following, so almost felt like 2 separate stories in one season. This is the season where we get a lot of revelations about the world and how it works, and things that we kind of came to know, quote quote, in the first 2 seasons, very much get challenged and change our understanding of like where the Titans came from, who the real villain is, and also just backstory into the characters that we met in seasons 1 and 2. Season 3 was also the one where we had a lot of characters experiencing a lot of self-doubt, and given the importance of some of the decisions they were making, you really just wanted to shake them and tell them to get over it. At the end of season 3, you can very much see how things are coming to a head, kind of like all of the battles that we fought in the previous seasons were really just precursors to the war that is coming in season 4. With this being a rewatch for me, I had actually seen to about halfway through season 4, and I very much appreciated that, because if I had come off season 3, you know, if this was being released in weekly episodes or something, and then I had to wait a year until the next season came out or anything like that, I would have got to season 4 and been like, what the actual heck is going on? Because the first chunk of the season, we're not focusing on characters that we know, like, and trust. We're with a completely different group of people in a completely different place. Thankfully, I had already seen it, so I knew that this was going to happen. But if I was watching that for the first time, I would have just been like, huh? Because I don't want to give you spoilers though, I'm not going to say too much about season 4. But as I've now watched the series, I would be somewhat curious to read the manga. I haven't really read a manga before though, so I don't know if it's necessarily something I'd enjoy. Probably worth investigating though. In terms of the ending of the series, as mentioned, I'm not going to give you spoilers for it, but as for my general thoughts, I'm not necessarily sad about the way it ended, but I would have preferred something a little different. I understand why things went down the way they did and how certain character beliefs led us to the place we got to, but it would have been nice to have something just a tad happier for some of our characters. There were also 2 characters in particular in season 4 that I was just so not impressed with. I spent pretty much the entire time just hating on them. Thankfully, both of those issues got resolved, albeit in different ways. Flipping over though, and we're onto the only book that got a full spread this month, and that would be Onyx Storm from Rebecca Yarros. Having done a reread of both Fourth Wing and Iron Flame in January, I was very eager to get to this one. Ideally, my reread in January would have finished just a tad earlier, so I could have started Onyx Storm on release day. That's not how it turned out, but that's fine. I knew I had to get to this one quickly though, otherwise I was gonna end up seeing spoilers. My Instagram feed had already started showing me not necessarily spoilers, but we were edging into the territory of, so I was very worried that I was going to get some kind of plot point spoiled for myself. And I swear that the algorithms on these apps are so good, because as soon as I finished the book, instantly my entire feed was just full of spoilers and reviews and analyses about what went down. In this series though, we are following our main character Violet, who was initially training to be a scribe, but then her mother pulled rank and decided, nope, you're actually indeed going to be going to the Riders Quadrant and training to be a dragon rider. Given that she's our main character and this is the third book, you can probably assume that she is still standing. And this book picks up right where Iron Flame left off, which I will say that our author is pretty damn good with her cliffhangers. That being said though, I think that the cliffhanger that we were left on at the end of this book, given that that seems to be like a typical pattern for the series, I don't think that that's a spoiler, but the cliffhanger that we were left on didn't feel as impactful as the last two. I feel like that from books 1 and 2, the cliffhangers that we were given were quite exciting and really made me want to pick up the next book, much to my own personal dismay, because when I originally read Iron Flame, Onyx Storm was not out yet, so I didn't have anywhere to go with my feelings. But this time around, I'm not necessarily sad about having to wait for the next book. Like, yes, I do want to pick it up and I will be reading it when it comes out, but I don't feel this kind of like physical compulsion to need to read the next book. As far as ratings go, I did rate this one lowest out of the 3 that we've had. So the first book I gave 5 star, the second I gave 4.5, I think, and this one I ended up giving 4, mainly because the book felt very much like an elongated fetch quest. Like, we're hopping around a bunch of different locations, trying to find things that are going to be integral for the problems that we're trying to solve. And so I felt like we were just getting a bunch of different place names and also people names thrown at us. I probably could have done with a glossary, because keeping up with the terms for the different places versus the different people, I did find a little bit tricky to keep up with. That being said, I didn't not enjoy the book, I still gave it 4 stars, but given how much I just loved Fourth Wing, I'm really hoping this doesn't become a trend for the series where, like, in the next book I end up giving it a 3.5 and then the one after that I give it a 3. I'm not counting my chickens because the book hasn't even been written yet, but I'm just hoping that that's not how it ends up. I will say though that some of the things I really enjoyed from this book was getting to see more of our characters and their relationships with their dragons, and also just having more, I don't know, page time, screen time, I don't know how you'd refer to it, for certain characters who in previous books have been kind of sidelined. I think that if I were to rate my most disappointing book from the month, it would probably be this one, but that's just because I had such high hopes for it. That's not to say it was a bad book, it's just that given my love of the first one in particular, this didn't necessarily measure up to the expectations I probably had for it. Obviously, in talking about these books and other media, I'm trying not to spoil plot points for you, because if you haven't seen it, I do want you to be able to go and watch it and experience that for the first time. But if you would prefer I just do spoiler reviews and you can skip chapters if you don't want to be spoiled for it, just let me know. I sometimes find that speaking in these kind of more like general or vague terms about the pieces of media can be a little bit challenging. I know it is a new skill that I'm trying to build, like this is only our second wrap-up video, but if you don't really mind the plot point being spoiled and you just want to hear my kind of unfiltered thoughts, then just let me know. At the top of this spread though, we're putting in the review for Crazy Stupid Love. This one was also a rewatch for me, and thus it is a 5-star rewatch. Most of the time I don't bother rereading or rewatching anything unless it is rated quite highly, and for this one in particular, I just saw a couple of reels with snippets from the movie, and that pretty much convinced me like, oh my gosh, I have to rewatch this one. The nice part about rewatching a movie like this, like one that I have previously seen multiple times, is that I could quote-quote watch it while doing other work, which means I didn't necessarily have to have my attention focused on the screen because I already know the story. This is very much one of those kind of like comfort movies for me, that and Easy A. Both great movies, highly recommend, but this is one of those stories where you have a lot of little separate narratives going on, but they actually all come together to be one overarching story. I really enjoy movies like that, and plus I also think that this movie had a great cast. We have Steve Steve Carell, Emma Stone, Ryan Gosling, Julianne Moore. It's just a fun movie and I'm probably gonna watch it again at some point. Probably not this year, but at some point. A movie that I hadn't seen previously though and had been meaning to watch, I thought I would include it in my list for my kind of Lucky in Love challenge for February. For that one, I effectively had a list of 20 movies and books that were in the romance genre, and I'd just roll a d20 to see which one I should consume. But one of the ones I included on the list and ended up rolling for was The Age of Adaline. This one ended up on the list, again because I saw clips of it on Reels and thought it looked interesting enough to explore further. And I guess you could say that in terms of disappointing movies, this was the biggest disappointment for me for the month. I just didn't find Adaline to be a particularly likable character. And like, yes, I understand that if you're the kind of person who doesn't age, and thus you're probably slowly watching all of the people close to you age and then maybe age out of life, that would be very hard for someone. I get it. And you'd probably want to protect your heart by not getting close to people and such. And also the potential concerns about being turned into like some kind of science experiment because people want to find out the secrets of not aging. But I just didn't really like her, and I also didn't find the love story between her and the male main character to be all that believable. In terms of the decoration for this one though, I decided to put a little camera down the bottom corner because Adaline does not like having her picture taken, probably because it is just a reminder that everybody else in her life is aging and she doesn't get to. Plus it could also be evidence that could be used against her at some point, though I'm not necessarily sure how much that was part of her decision-making process. I'm not necessarily sad that I watched it, mainly because I put it on while I was doing other work anyway, so it didn't really feel like time wasted at all. But if I had have put this on for like my Friday night movie watch, I would have been kind of bummed. Having learned from January though that I do definitely want to have more space to review my book club reads, rather than tucking my review for Psyche and Eros into a quarter of a spread, I decided to have it take up the entire of the right hand page. I find that following the discussion we have in book club, I usually have a lot more thoughts that I want to record about any of the books we're reading. And for January's read, Nettle and Bone, I set up my review before we had the meeting, which meant I didn't really have a lot of thoughts to record. Like I probably could have filled half a page, but I didn't feel like I needed to. And then once the meeting was over, I was like, great, now I have heaps of thoughts that I want to record and nowhere to record them. This time around, I waited until after our meeting so that I could discuss the book with other book club members, especially because them sharing their thoughts makes me think more about the book we've read. But this one is a Greek mythology retelling, so the story of Psyche and Eros. And going into it not knowing a lot about Greek mythology certainly had an impact on my enjoyment of the story, and not necessarily in a bad way, but I very much approached it in the same way that I approach true crime documentaries, or like true crime dramatizations, where I'm like constantly pausing what I'm watching to go and look up whether these things are factual. It's like, ooh, did that person actually say that? Did that person actually catch the killer? Like, what's going on here? Where have we used like creative license versus the kind of facts of the case? Now, I wasn't necessarily looking up the facts here because this is mythology, more so just the source material and whether that was in the original story. But this one I ended up rating at 3.5 stars, mainly because the first half of the book felt very slow to get into. We're kind of getting the backstory of both of our individual characters, which gives us context in terms of the way they think and such. But I kind of came to this thinking it was going to be more a love story, so I was kind of hoping for more of a love story, or at least more of a romantic love story between the two main characters. One of the things I did find interesting though was this idea of decision making based on prophecies. Now I've been told that that's a common thing in Greek mythology, but it kind of got me thinking a little bit outside of the book in terms of how beliefs can shape choices, which can in turn shape like behaviors and futures. It'll be something that I'll have to do some journaling on, not necessarily in my reading journal because it's going to be more of like a philosophical thing from my personal life and such, but I did like that even though it wasn't a non-fiction book, it still got me thinking about those kind of things. Given that I didn't leave enough space in my February pages, we're actually flipping to beyond the March setup and putting our next reviews in there, even though these pieces of media were consumed in February. It doesn't really bother me too much, as said before. I'm not really fussed if things are out of order, as long as they're placed in a spot that makes sense, like I have enough space to write in what I want to. I have books or TV shows next to other ones in the series, you know, if I've consumed them around the same time. But in terms of the review that we're putting up the top here, this is for a TV show called You Can't Ask That. This is an Australian show that I watched one time when I was over at my parents' house, when they still lived in Melbourne, and when I saw it come up on Netflix recently, I thought it would be a good thing to watch while I was doing work, mainly because you don't really need to watch the screen, it's more so like you can listen to it like a podcast. And it's a really interesting concept. They effectively take a group of people from some kind of minority group, or a group of people who don't fit into the box of like cisgendered white people, and they ask them questions that have been, I assume, submitted by an outside source that are things that wouldn't really be appropriate to ask them. I thought it was just a really good way to highlight that these people who are often seen as, quote, other, are actually, in fact, still people. And I especially liked it when the same question was asked to, multiple people in this minority, and they had different answers to each other. It goes to show that, like, even if they fit into this same kind of grouping of people, that doesn't mean you don't have diversity within that group as well. The first season had episodes on people of small stature, polyamory, transgender people, Indigenous Australians, Muslims, fat people, convicted felons, and those with a terminal illness. Each of the episodes is like 15 to 25 minutes long, just depending on which one you're watching. And I'm certainly keen to watch the next seasons as well, but I haven't gotten around to it just yet. As mentioned before, I don't necessarily rate my TV shows, but I'd be willing to give this one a decently high rating because I found it really interesting. At the bottom of this page, I'm putting in another TV show because it seemed I watched a lot of TV in February, and this one is for Queer Eye Season 9. I know this one isn't a super new release, and I also know that I definitely held off on watching this because Bobby left and we got somebody new. I think I was probably quite skeptical about whether I was gonna like this new person and like, are they gonna throw off the group dynamic, or what if they kind of like suck or something and they ruin the show for me? Turns out all of those were completely unfounded thoughts because I love Jeremiah. He is absolutely excellent. He's so wholesome. He like cries at the end of every episode when they do the reveal to the person who they're focusing on. He just seems very genuine and very wholesome, and I absolutely love him as an addition to the show. It wasn't specifically intentional to make the color palette of this review space to be so similar to the one above it, and it turns out that having put in the first review spot from March, that one's also blue leaning, so I'm kind of tempted to hold off until I can find another review that is also blue to put in the bottom right corner. Flipping back though, I wanted to update my Lucky in Love challenge so that I had a record of which pieces of media I completed as part of that challenge specifically. Not everything that I consumed in the month was part of this challenge, but the ones that are, I've already checked off on my list. On the right hand page though, I just wanted to stick in the covers for them. So of the things that I watched and read, the ones that counted for my Lucky in Love challenge were Age of Adaline, Psyche and Eros, Crazy Stupid Love, Funny Story, Anyone But You, and Lights Out. They certainly offered a variety in terms of the types of romance we were looking at, ranging from kind of comedy romance to dark romance, and I guess also some mythological romance with Psyche and Eros. I probably would have liked to have had more from the challenge completed, but I think that considering I also consumed so much outside of the challenge, this isn't really all that bad. With those ones stuck in though, it's time to fill in my February recap page. This is where I put in all the statistics for the month in terms of what I consumed, how many of each type of media, what were my favorites, what were the kind of like statistic breakdowns of those things. The first thing I'm filling in here is just what I call the media breakdown, so how many books, how many movies, so on and so forth. In February, I finished 5 books, 3 movies, 6 TV show seasons, and 1 game. The game didn't get a review layout though, because I'd already put that in for January, and I didn't really feel like I needed to review the same game twice. Jumping over to the top of the right hand page though, this is where I put in some statistics that are mainly for reads, but I also have 1 statistic that's for watchables. The 5 we have here are average rating, pages read, minutes watched, series, and standalones. For February, my average rating was 3.9, which is just calculated from taking all of the books I read, adding up the score that I gave them out of 5, and then dividing by the number of books I finished. For the number of pages read, this is the combined total from those 5 books. So for this one, I had 1,952 pages. In terms of minutes watched though, this is for TV shows and movies, and this number was decently high given the number of TV shows I consumed. That one coming in at 3,160 minutes, or 52 hours and 40 minutes. Of the books I read, 1 of them was part of a series and 4 of them were standalones. On the lower 2/3 of this page though, this is where I like to put in my pie graphs for the statistics that I'm tracking. The 3 different stats I have, they're all related to books. We have formats read, genres read, and ratings. To make the pie graphs, I just jump into Microsoft Word. I've got a template in there that I use, mainly so that I can have the correct sizing for each of the circles. I just input my data and it makes the pie graphs for me, but I print them out without any color so that I can color them in using the pens that I've selected for my monthly color palette. Something that I found quite interesting for February was the number of books I read as a mixture, so not strictly like an ebook or an audiobook, but a combination of both. The one audiobook that I recorded on here, I did technically read a very, very small portion of as an ebook, but it was so small that I felt like it didn't really count. And technically for the one that I recorded as being a digital book, that one I did do a very small amount of as an audiobook as well. So I guess technically you could say that all of my books were a mixture, but I kind of like to specify whether it's one or the other if the majority of the reading, like a genuine vast majority of the reading, has been in one format. As for genres, I was expecting to finish a self-help book in February, but I didn't quite finish it before the month was over, so that one's getting recorded in March. And then as for ratings, 2 of the books were 3.5 star, 2 of them were 4 star, and 1 of them I rated at 4.5. In the bottom section of the left-hand page though, this is where I like to put in my favorite quotes from the month, with these ones coming from the books that I've read. Now I could have done a better job while I was reading, taking down what these quotes were, because I effectively had to go look all of them up. So I think that's something that I'm going to keep in mind for March, is while I'm reading, if I come across a quote that I really like, jot it down somewhere so I don't have to go hunting for it when I fill in my March recap. But the 3 quotes that I picked, we have 1 from Funny Story, 1 from Lights Out, and 1 from Onyx Storm. And technically one of them is actually a misquote because I looked it up on Goodreads rather than looking it up in my book, and somebody had written it down wrong. It's fine, the sentiment is okay, but the space that I'm yet to fill in on this February recap are my highlights. This is where I pick 4 pieces of media that were standouts from the month, and typically these would be the highest rated, or at least the highest rated that weren't like rereads or rewatches, but of course I don't rate my TV shows. So we can also just think of these as the most memorable moments of the month. The ones that I selected were Lights Out, because I had such a good time reading it with my friends. Funny Story, because it was my first Emily Henry and I really enjoyed it. Season 1 of You Can't Ask That, because I think it did well to offer some perspective onto different people and the way their lives are. And I also put in Attack on Titan, not necessarily specifying a particular season, but more so just having it here as a way to commemorate our marathon. Flipping back though, so that we can flip through, I am definitely worried about fitting an entire year in this journal, in the sense that I'm pretty sure I'm not going to fit an entire year in this journal. With the start of journal pages, the January through March setup pages, and then all of the reviews I've been doing, I'm pretty much halfway into this notebook, and that doesn't even probably account for the first 3 months of the year. That means we might end up with a mid-year reading journal setup. I'm not making any promises, but it is very, very likely. If you want to make sure that you don't miss that one when it comes out, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you are a reading or reading journal enthusiast, then I would love to invite you to our reading community. That one is free to join, we would love to have you, and it's linked in the description box below. For more setups in this journal though, the playlist on screen is where it's at. That one has the start of journal setup, all of these monthly wrap-ups, and the monthly setups themselves. So click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.